A stage burns with torchlight in the Roman night. Not a courtroom, not the Senate, but a stage real and trembling in the fire's glow. At its center stands a man draped in white Greek robes, fingers curled around a lyre lips, moving softly to the rhythm of Euripides. He is not a poet. He is Nero, emperor of Rome, master of the civilized world. The audience sits still, not in reverence, but in dread. Because one mistimed cough, one glance held too long, and death could fall as quickly as a single wrong note. And through the haunting music, imagine another scene slicing into view, blood seeping into cold stone, a woman beaten to death by men sent by her own son. Agrippina, who once wrested a crown from fate and placed it on the head of her only child. She didn't die on a battlefield, but in her chamber, because loyalty meant nothing once her son started believing he was divine. Octavia followed his wife, banished, tortured, murdered, her only crime being that she failed to please him. Poppaea came next, his mistress pregnant, silenced forever with a single kick for daring to complain during a storm of rage. And then Rome, the eternal city, the heart of an empire, went up in flames. As smoke curled into the heavens and people screamed for their lives. Stories say Nero stood on a balcony, reciting poetry, playing music, performing as the world beneath him turned to ash. This is the Nero history remembers the madman who played while the city burned. But what history rarely lingers on is his death. Not noble, not defiant, not even tragic. Just small, panicked, pathetic. A lonely end buried in obscurity, sounding less like the final breath of a god and more like the sob of a child abandoned in a nightmare of his own design. They call him the last emperor of the Julio-Claudian line, the final link in a golden chain. But listen closer, this wasn't a dynasty's fall. It was the quiet collapse of a man, undone not by enemies, but by his own fear. A boy lifted to the summit of power before he knew what it meant to be human. An artist deluded who tried to make an empire his stage, only to realize the audience had long stopped watching. You know the name Nero, but you've never truly heard how he died. And that truth, bare, broken, terrifying cuts deeper than all the horrors he ever unleashed. This time, let history speak plainly. And before we descend into the forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you find meaning in unearthing the hidden corners of the past, don't forget to like and subscribe so you never miss what history was too ashamed to tell. And tell me, where are you listening from? It's strange and beautiful that across oceans and continents, through wires and screens, we can sit together in the dark and remember. Connected not by time, not by place, but by something far more powerful, the desire to understand how we got here. He wasn't born to rule. He was born a pawn, a single link in a twisted chain of incestuous marriages, forced successions and rotting political schemes that had long hollowed out the heart of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, the name that Rome would one day whisper in fear, entered the world, not into the cradle of power, but into a nest of knives drawn in the shadows. His father was a decaying nobleman, once proud to have kicked his pregnant wife in the belly, boasting that this was how a true Roman man asserted himself. His mother, Agrippina the younger, was granddaughter to Augustus' sister to Caligula, and the only one in the imperial court who didn't fall to the madness of others, because she knew how to survive. And her weapon was her son. From the moment Nero lay in his cradle, he was no longer a child. He was a seed of power, Agrippina gripped like a double-edged blade. She seduced and manipulated the most powerful men in Rome, marrying the Emperor Claudius, then poisoning him to clear a path for her son. Not because she believed Nero would make a great ruler, but because she believed he'd be the most obedient puppet Rome had ever seen. At 17, Nero ascended the throne amid cheers he couldn't quite tell were meant for him, or for the woman standing behind it. He had tutor Seneca, the famed Stoic philosopher, summoned to be the mind behind the mask. Burrus, the head of the Praetorian Guard, served as gatekeeper to real power. And Agrippina, ever present, never more than a curtain away, whispered behind every imperial meeting, guiding every word, every nod, every glance. In those early months, Nero wasn't allowed to think. The choices were Seneca's. The power was Burrus's. The will was his mother's. He simply sat there drowning in a toga far too large, the laurel crown resting on his head, like a prop on a boy pretending to be divine. And even then, he understood this throne wasn't a triumph. It was a golden cage. Every decision was choreographed. Every affection offered only because his bloodline was right. Perhaps it was then, somewhere in the quiet panic of being 17, that Nero began to perform, not to rule, but to survive. He learned to smile while being controlled, learned to please his tutor, his mother, the crowds. But somewhere in that gaze there flickered something different, something no one cared to see. The boy didn't want to be emperor. He wanted out. But Roman history has no exits. Once you sit on the throne, you either become a god or a monster. And Nero, in those early days, was neither. He was just a frightened boy trapped inside the armor of divinity, struggling to stay upright on top of a world built from blood, steel, and lies. And like any child pressed down for too long, he would eventually learn to strike back, not to grow, but to take revenge. Breaking free from his mother's grip didn't make Nero an emperor. It only convinced him he was already a god. And a god, at least in Nero's understanding, wasn't meant to rule. A god was meant to be worshipped. He didn't see the empire as a machine to be governed, but as a colossal stage, every gaze a spotlight, every applause timed to his command. If the early years of his reign were like a musical score composed by Seneca and Burrus, then now Nero wanted to write his own symphony, sing every note, and force the world to listen, whether it liked it or not. He began turning the imperial court into a theatre. State councils were replaced with poetry nights, lavish banquets, and musical competitions. Nero performed in Greek tragedy, voices recited verses, played instruments, even competed in the Olympics, and of course, he always won. Not because he deserved to, but because no one dared let the emperor lose. Real athletes were ordered to fall at the right moment. Talented singers were silenced. Prizes meant for the best were reduced to mere props for a man staging his own fantasy of greatness in a drama only he believed in. The more addicted he became to the spotlight, the more he craved freedom. And freedom to Nero meant severing everything that reminded him he had once been a puppet. Agrippina, his mother, the one who had led him by the hand to the throne, was the deepest shadow. She began demanding more power, appearing in court, inserting herself into affairs as if she were the true ruler. Nero couldn't stand it. He plotted her murder. First a staged shipwreck, but she survived. Eventually, he sent assassins to her home. They stabbed her to death. Legend says her final words were, "Strike the womb that bore him." True or not, her death marked a turning point with no return. Nero was no longer the child under control. He had learned how to kill. Next came Octavia, his wife, whom he never loved but couldn't simply discard. She was falsely accused of adultery, exiled to an island, and executed shortly after. When the people of Rome wept for her, Nero banned anyone from speaking her name. But history remembers what the law forbids. Then came Poppaea Sabina, the beautiful mistress Nero adored with obsessive passion. He gave her riches, titles, and believed that for once he had something entirely his own. But Nero's love had no boundaries. In a fit of rage after she dared to complain, he kicked her while she was pregnant. The blow killed both mother and child. Later, he had a temple built in her honor, worshipping her as a goddess. But statues cannot forgive, and corpses do not love back. In the year 64, Rome burned. A fire raged for 7 days, and nights reducing half the city to ash. People ran through crumbling streets, praying as walls collapsed around them. No one knew the true cause. But rumors spread faster than flames. Nero had set the city alight himself, simply to clear space for a new palace. He had been away in Antium, but rushed back not to help, but to admire the view. They say he stood atop his private theatre, dressed in a costume, playing his lyre, reciting lines about the burning of Troy. Rome to him was no longer the heart of an empire, it was scenery. A spectacular backdrop for the greatest role of his life, Nero, the artist of the apocalypse he had written himself. When the flames died, and the smoke still hung heavy in the air, Nero began constructing the Domus Aurea, the Golden House. A vast palace plated in gold, inlaid with gems, its ceiling rotating like the stars above, with a colossal statue of himself, towering over 30 meters high. It rose from the ashes of thousands of homes, and by then, no one doubted who had lit the first match. But to cleanse guilt, Nero needed a scapegoat. He chose a strange, misunderstood group, separated from Roman society, the followers of a crucified Jew named Jesus. They were blamed for the fire. Thousands were arrested, tortured, and executed. Some were sewn into animal skins and torn apart by dogs. Others were nailed to crosses and burned alive at night, living torches for Nero's garden parties. He stood there, basking in the light of human flames, and declared himself the savior of Rome. The court fell silent. Those who had once dared to speak truth were either dead or had learned to bow low. Seneca, once the beacon of reason, now weighed every word like a sycophant. No one told Nero the truth anymore. No one dared point out the blood pooling at his feet. They only clapped like desperate spectators trapped in a performance they could never leave. And Nero could no longer tell where the act ended and the truth began. He believed in the character he had created, believed he was divine, an artist untouchable. But the louder the applause grew, the farther reality slipped away. And one day, when the curtain finally fell, there would be no one left to clap. There's a thin line between genius and madness, and Nero crossed it without ever looking back. He no longer saw himself as an emperor. He believed he was Apollo, god of light, music, and poetry. Statues of him rose across the empire not as a ruler, but as a living deity, larger than any mortal ever carved in stone, a halo of golden rays cast around his head, a lyre forever in hand. At his banquets, he stopped calling himself Caesar. He was Nero Apollo, bringer of harmony to a chaotic world. And to keep that illusion alive, an entire empire had to applaud. From Rome to Antioch, from Alexandria to Gaul, every one of Nero's performances became a sacred ritual. Subjects weren't allowed to yawn, cough, or look away. Exhausted spectators faked death just to be carried out of the theatre. Senators sat sweating in heavy togas under the punishing summer heat, forced to laugh, even when Nero missed a note, not because they enjoyed it, but because they knew the cost of silence. The deeper Nero sank into his fabricated light, the further he drifted from reality. The empire was no longer his concern. Troops at the borders went without reinforcements. Far provinces were squeezed dry with heavy taxes to fund his obsessions, rotating palaces, artificial lakes, colossal stages. And when loyal lands began to go quiet, Nero didn't hear them. Or maybe he simply chose not to. The first crack came from Gaul. Gaius Julius Vindex, the governor there, openly revolted. He refused to pay taxes and declared Nero unworthy of the throne. To Nero, it was a mosquito buzzing in the background of his divine symphony. But to Rome, it was the first tremor beneath a crumbling pillar. Then came Hispania. General Galba, aged, measured, and respected, declared he would restore order to the empire. This wasn't protest. It was a challenge. Inside his golden palace, Nero kept throwing banquets, reciting verse, forcing senators into stage competitions, making them dress as actors and bow before his art. But outside those marble walls, the empire was falling apart. And perhaps worse than rebellion was the quiet death of those who once loved him. Seneca, the philosopher, the teacher who once dreamed of shaping a boy into a wise ruler, was forced to take his own life, a grotesque play drenched in blood and tears. They say that as his pulse faded, he still tried to recite poetry to comfort his students, as if hoping his final words might still reach the boy he once believed in. Others from Nero's early circle exiled, murdered in shadows, or silenced until death. There was a time when Nero was hailed as the bright hope of a new age, the golden youth after the aging rule of Claudius. He had once been the promise of a better future. But now, with every step he took, the people stepped back, not out of reverence, but out of fear. The crowd applauds now, out of fear, not love. That whisper echoed through the marble halls of Roman power like a death knell. But Nero didn't hear it, or refused to. In his mind, Rome was still his stage. He was still divine, and the world would always bow to the music. But the truth is, every audience eventually walks away, and the God no one believes in becomes just another clown left alone in the fading light. It wasn't a war or a grand conspiracy or a dagger slipping into his back under moonlight. Nero's fall began with something far smaller, a hairline crack, a faint sound barely noticeable. But in that stillness, something shifted. The fear that once held an empire together had vanished. Gaius Julius Vindex, a provincial noble from Gaul, once loyal, once silent, now stood in open revolt. He wasn't mad. He wasn't hungry for power. He didn't want the throne. But he said out loud what the rest of Rome had only dared to mutter in shadows. Nero was no longer worthy. Refusing to pay taxes, gathering his own troops, calling upon other generals to save Rome from a lunatic wrapped in divine robes, Vindex became the first man under Nero's rule to defy him without being burned, butchered, or buried in silence. The foundations of power began to tremble, and Nero didn't even notice. When the news arrived, he was performing. Deep within the golden gardens of his palace, on a private stage built just for him, Nero was acting out a Greek tragedy of his own writing. Sweat beaded on his forehead, his voice strained with emotion, and the audience clapped not from admiration, but out of sheer survival. A courtier whispered in his ear about the rebellion, and Nero barely flinched. Vindex. He's just bitter. He can't play music. Then he turned back to the stage, still calling Rome, his sacred audience, the ears of the gods. But the crack widened. In distant Hispania, a general named Galba, older, quieter, harder to read, had heard enough. No speeches, no oaths, no poetry. He simply stood, looked his men in the eye, and said he would be emperor. No lightning struck, no divine voice called down, just one man speaking without fear, and an empire that listened. He didn't need to fight for the crown, because Rome, tired and ashamed, was ready to bring it to him. Back in the capital, Nero began to feel the chill. The halls of his palace grew quieter. Familiar faces stopped appearing. One general fell ill. One advisor asked to leave the city. One guardsman left his post and didn't return. People on the street no longer bowed or cheered. They lowered their eyes, walked faster, vanished into doorways. The crowds were still there, but the air had changed. No joy, no reverence, just eyes that refused to meet his. One morning, Nero woke, and the palace felt hollow. The guards were gone. His attendants said nothing. A trembling voice told him the praetorians had left. Galba was marching. The Senate was meeting. He laughed, thinking it was all a joke, a poorly timed jest. He went to his music room to escape into melody, but the strings on his lyre had snapped. He called for someone to fix it. No one came. Then the words reached him, words he had never imagined hearing. The Senate had declared him an enemy of the people. No longer a god, no longer a ruler, just a man with no place left to stand. He ran through the palace, calling out for the men who once surrounded him, raised him up, worshipped him, locked doors, silent rooms. He called their names: Seneca, Tigellinus, Petronius, but only silence answered. They were gone, not in betrayal, in indifference. They didn't even hate him enough to turn on him. They simply left. And that perhaps was the cruelest ending of all, not a knife in the back, but the realization that no one cared enough to deliver it. From ruler of the known world, he had become a ghost in his own palace, unable to find a single soul willing to follow him into exile. No hand reached for his. No voice called out his name. No rider rode with him into the night. His name, once carved into triumphal arches, now echoed only in his own mind, a whisper lost among marble walls and golden ceilings that no longer belonged to him. No sword took Nero's life. Rome didn't strike him down. It simply stopped looking. And in that silence, louder than any scream, the last god of Rome crumbled. Nero fled into the night, not like a fallen king, but like a thief chased out by the very world he once ruled. No escort trailed behind him. No golden chariots, no farewell trumpets, no dignity. Just a shadow slipping through Rome's back streets, head hidden beneath a wide-brimmed slave's hat, shoulders cloaked in a servant's worn robe, feet sinking into the mud of the same city that once crowned his every step, with rose petals and praise. With him were only 3, a forgotten courtier, a trembling secretary, and one last loyal soul, Epaphroditus. Behind them, the city lay still. The city he had once called a masterpiece of my genius, now silent, indifferent. The same streets that had once echoed with cheers and verses, now held only closed shutters, darkened windows, barking dogs, and the fading footsteps of a man running after the ghost of what he used to be. They reached a decaying villa just outside the city property of a former slave Nero had once favored. The gates creaked open. No torches lit the entrance. No voices welcomed him. Just cold walls and emptiness. Nero stepped inside, breath sharp and uneven. He was no longer an emperor. He was a fugitive trying to outrun the weight of his own legacy. He didn't sleep. All through the night he paced, whispering to Epaphroditus. What will they do to me? Are they coming? Will they forgive me? No answers came. At one point, he pressed his ear to the ground, listening, flinching at the imagined sound of hooves, Roman hooves. Not rebels, not rioters, but soldiers. His soldiers. The same men who had once sworn loyalty, now coming to drag him back, not to execute him swiftly, but to humiliate him publicly. The Senate had not ordered his death. No, what they planned was worse. They wanted him returned in chains, dragged through the streets of Rome, spat on, mocked, stoned. Not a clean end, but a performance. Not the final act of a ruler, but the cheap finale of a broken performer displayed not on a stage, but in a circus of shame. When dawn began to bleed into the sky, Nero understood. The moment had come, but no one moved. No one reached for the knife. No one wanted to carry the mark of the man who killed the emperor. Not out of loyalty. Out of fear of history, of divine wrath, of what this death would mean. So Nero, hands, trembling, reached for the blade himself. Steel caught the morning light. His fingers shook his lips, moved as if to speak, then cracked, and he began to weep. No one had ever seen Nero cry. Not on stage, not in court, not when Rome burned, not even when his wife died. But now, in a crumbling villa, surrounded by 3 silent men, the self-proclaimed Apollo broke down like a child lost in his own ruins. A great artist is about to die, he whispered. Qualis artifex perio. Not I was the last emperor, not remember me as a warrior, but an artist. Even at the end, he didn't understand. He didn't see that Rome had never needed an artist on the throne, that blood and verse could not be blended into poetry, that an empire does not sing, it does not mourn, and it never forgives those who try to turn it into a stage. He raised the blade to his neck, but his hands were too weak, the thrust shallow. Blood came, but not enough, clumsy, hesitant. Then Epaphroditus stepped forward, his own hand shaking, and pressed the dagger deeper. No trumpets, no theatre, no applause. Only one final gasp, a jolt of pain swallowed in silence. An emperor had died. No one said his name. No one marked the hour. And worst of all, no one cared to witness it. There was no army riding to his rescue. No imperial cloak draped over his lifeless body. No funeral oration rising in the Senate chamber. After that final scream, after the last thrust of the blade, everything passed as if Nero had never existed at all. The man who once called himself the embodiment of Apollo, who once forced an empire to hold its breath while he recited verse, now lay buried without ritual, without honor, beneath a patch of dry country soil. A few remaining slaves, loyal perhaps, or perhaps simply too afraid to flee, scraped out a shallow grave and covered their fallen master like men trying to hide a crime rather than mourn a death. And then silence. Rome did not mourn him. The historians did not grieve. His statues were smashed, his name chiseled off stone. A cold wind swept across the dynasty he had tried to carve from blood, poetry, and power. The Senate declared damnatio memoriae, a sentence worse than death. Nero's name was forbidden to be spoken. His likeness scraped from marble reliefs. His coins melted down, his image erased, and the official histories of Rome reduced him to a madman, nothing more. Yet like all those condemned by the pens of victors, Nero refused to die in memory. In the East, Rumors stirred that Nero had escaped death, that he had slipped into hiding and would return to reclaim his empire. In Greece, where once they had crowned him with laurel as a performer, some still whispered his final words. Qualis, artifex pareo. What an artist dies in me. His death became more than the end of a man. It became a mirror held up to a collapsing age. A symbol of a world rotting beneath the weight of its own excess. A warning that absolute power does not simply corrupt, it devours. And worst of all, it isolates. Because in the end, no death is lonelier than the death of the man who once commanded the applause of an empire. There is a strange irony in history. Sometimes the most hated are the ones who live the longest in collective memory. Nero the emperor erased from stone inscriptions, his bronze statues shattered. His name, banned from all official rites, ultimately could not be forgotten. The Roman Senate tried to bury him under the ash of oblivion, but in marketplaces, in travelling songs, in whispered words among the poor quarters. The name Nero lived on. They said he hadn't died, that he had fled east, changed his name, regained his strength, that one day he would ride back in his purple cloak to reclaim the empire that betrayed him. 3 false Neros would rise, each claiming to be the returned emperor. And the terrifying truth people believed. Not because they loved him, but because they couldn't accept that someone like him could die like a trembling dog in the night. The idea that Nero survived even as myth was the people's reaction to a story too absurd to be real. Centuries later, Nero became the face of tyranny, of decadence, of madness. But he was also resurrected as a haunting silhouette of personal freedom, twisted, diseased, yet magnetic. The only man who dared stand on stage before the Senate, who pulled the entire empire into the audience for his poem. An artist wearing the mask of an emperor, or an emperor, forever playing the artist. Perhaps that was his true crime. Not that Nero was too cruel, Rome had seen worse. Not that he was an artist, the empire had honoured poets and philosophers. But because Nero was too alive, too human, a soul full of longing, chaos and vulnerability, who dared to show weakness, dared to cry, to sing, to fear. In a world that demanded its emperors be divine, cold, rational, invincible, a man who was too real was the greatest threat of all. And so Nero was condemned, not just by those who hated him, but by an empire that could not bear the reflection of itself in the shattered mirror of a man.